A black woman stood before the Supreme Court and got silenced 7 times by another black woman in a robe. That's not a headline. That's a reckoning. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked into the highest court in the land, she didn't just carry a case. She carried the weight of every grandmother who stood in line for 6 hours just to vote. She carried the echoes of church basements, of worn-out voter registration cards, of whispered warnings. Don't speak too loud, child. But she did speak, and what followed shocked every soul in that courtroom. Justice Katanji Brown Jackson, hailed as a symbol of progress, interrupted Crockett again and again, not to diminish her, but to demand something deeper: rigor over rhetoric, law over legacy, principle over performance. What began as a political spectacle became a constitutional turning point. One sentence turned the courtroom cold, but the next one lit a fire. The Constitution hadn't felt in decades. The ceiling of the Supreme Court glowed under the solemn weight of history. Columns of stone, carved with the promise of justice, towered over the courtroom like silent judges of their own. The oak doors creaked open and in walked a woman wrapped in purple. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't tiptoe in. She moved like she belonged, like history owed her something back. Her sharp purple blazer cut through the monochrome sea of navy suits and black robes. She was fire in a cold chamber. The gallery stirred. Reporters whispered. Clerks glanced up from their notes. There she was, the viral freshman from Texas, the one who dressed like resistance and spoke like rebellion. She didn't just come to argue, she came to be seen. But the woman seated on the bench above her didn't flinch. Justice Katanji Brown Jackson, robe flowing like shadow, sat with the stillness of granite, her face unreadable. No nod, no smile, no warmth, just the sharp gaze of a jurist who'd buried decades in law books and handed out sentences with surgical precision. 2 black women, 1 courtroom. But this wasn't sisterhood. This was war over the soul of the Constitution. Earlier that morning, Jasmine had stood outside on the steps of the court, telling a ring of cameras, "Justice Jackson won't intimidate me with Harvard credentials. This court needs to hear the truth." And now, inside, her words floated in the chamber like smoke she couldn't take back. She approached the podium, adjusted the mic with a smile that was half confidence, half performance. She had made headlines in Congress, demolished talking points on live TV, and turned hearings into viral moments. She had arrived at this moment thinking she could do the same here. But the Supreme Court is not Capitol Hill. As she cleared her throat to begin, you could almost feel the oxygen shrink. She looked up at the justices, pausing for effect. "My grandmother," she began, "waited 6 hours in the Texas heat to vote. These laws would have denied her that right. That's not just wrong. That's un-American." Her voice rang out bold. Her timing was perfect for cable news, but not for Justice Jackson, who leaned forward. "Counsel," she said, voice level, but firm. "While personal narratives are compelling, this court must focus on constitutional questions. Could you address the standard of review you believe should apply?" Silence. 30 seconds. That's all it took for the first interruption. Crockett blinked. The courtroom stirred. Even the marble seemed to echo the shift. Of course, Justice Jackson," she stammered. "But I think it's important to frame the real-world impact before diving into..." "Counsel," Jackson cut in again, sharper. "The legal technicalities, as you call them, are precisely what determine our analysis." Second interruption. The confidence Crockett carried into the chamber began to crack. This wasn't a rally. This was a battlefield of precedent and procedure. Her purple power suit didn't shield her here. She tried again. "We believe strict scrutiny applies, Your Honor, because these laws burden a fundamental right and target racial minorities. As the first black woman on this court, I'm sure you understand." Third interruption. But this time, Jackson didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. "My personal background is irrelevant to this legal analysis," she said. "Please focus on legal argument, not identity politics." The air dropped 10 degrees. You could feel it in the room. Even the conservative justices shifted. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a reprimand. One that landed harder because it came from someone who looked like her. Jasmine Crockett stood there, momentarily silenced. Not by hatred, but by expectation. She had come in with the weight of generations behind her, but now she stood under the weight of the law itself, and Justice Jackson had drawn the line. 7 justices watched. The gallery leaned in. Was Crockett going to crash in flames or rise in fire? The purple had faded. Not the color on her jacket. It still blazed defiantly from the podium, but its power had vanished. The courtroom no longer saw purple. It saw posture, performance, and pressure breaking under precision. Justice Jackson's second interruption had left Jasmine Crockett visibly off balance, but it was the third that drew blood, not from voice, but from values. Please focus on legal argument, not identity, politics. The words cut deeper than a gavel, and they didn't echo. They stuck. In a room where every sentence is transcribed, every pause examined. That one line would become a quote taught in law schools. And for Crockett, it was the moment she realized she wasn't standing on the Capitol floor anymore. This was no place for applause lines. This was where arguments either stood on the Constitution or crumbled under it. She shuffled her notes, eyes scanning too quickly. The fourth interruption came fast. That statistic, Jackson said sharply, is not in the record before us. Can you point to where it appears in the district court proceedings? Crockett hesitated. For just a second. But in this chamber, 1 second is eternity. I can get that citation for you. Justice Jackson, she offered, trying to recover. But the broader point stands. We need specific citations, not broad assertions. Jackson cut in again. This court deals in constitutional interpretation backed by evidence and precedent. Fifth interruption. The room was now silent, but it wasn't still. Something was shifting. Crockett could feel it. She had entered this place with a voice sharpened by protest. But the rules here weren't made for shouting. They were made for shaping law. And Jackson was making it clear. You do not shape the law with feelings alone. Even allies in the press gallery began to murmur. A few pens stopped writing. A few cameras zoomed out. This was not what they had come to see. Not the firebrand, not the fighter, but someone flailing in front of a woman who'd been tested by fire long before her. Crockett adjusted the mic, her hands no longer steady. Then came the 6th interruption. But it wasn't loud. It was deadly calm. Counsel, this court has no interest in your media framing or legislative sound bites. Jackson said, you are not here to be quoted. You are here to be constitutional. The blow landed hard. Crockett's throat tightened. No applause. No retort. Just heat, rising under fluorescent lights. This wasn't a rejection of her identity. It was a rejection of her approach. And it came from someone who shared her identity, but refused to let it be used as a shortcut to credibility. 7th interruption. And this one wasn't even a sentence. It was a look. Justice Jackson folded her hands and simply stared, waiting. She didn't need to say anything. She had already said enough. 7 cuts. 7 standards raised. And Crockett had met none there. You could hear it in the creak of chairs, in the scribble of pens. Even the other justices, conservative and liberal alike, were no longer watching a case. They were watching a reckoning. Crockett knew what was happening. She was being stripped, not of dignity, but of decorations. The camera-ready lines, the media polish, the congressional cadence, they all crumbled. This court didn't want a star. It wanted a lawyer. And Jasmine Crockett, Texas firebrand, viral congresswoman, champion of voting rights, had come unarmed. But then something shifted. She looked down at her notes, then past them. Beyond the stats, beyond the talking points, her hand moved slowly to her jacket, and in front of the highest bench in the land, she took it off. She took it off. Not with flourish, not for drama, but with intent. Jasmine Crockett slipped her arms out of the purple jacket like she was shedding something heavier than fabric performance. Underneath, a crisp white blouse. Plain, silent, clean. It didn't command the room. It earned the right to belong in it. And in that instant, the courtroom recalibrated. She stepped back to the mic. No more smiles. No wide hand gestures. No firebrand rhythm. Her voice dropped not in volume, but in weight. Your Honors, she began. I stand corrected on my approach. Let me address the constitutional questions directly. The gallery fell still. Even Justice Jackson, who had not blinked in 20 minutes, leaned back ever so slightly, watching. Not warning, Crockett breathed. Once. then said the words that finally landed. This case hinges on Section 11C of the Georgia law, which grants county election boards the unchecked authority to close polling locations without public notice or justification. No preamble, no story, just the Constitution speaking through her voice. That discretionary power with no standards is the exact flaw this court struck down in Louisiana v. United States. 1965. Now that named the case from a segregated South wasn't just historical, it was strategic. Justice Thomas looked up, Justice Kagan reached for her pen, and Justice Jackson raised an eyebrow. Crockett continued, her hands now calmly gripping the podium. When combined with the racial impact data in the record, particularly Appendix pages 287 through 303, this provision doesn't just create a disparate effect. It constructs a structural defect. She paused. Deliberately. A defect. This court has a duty to dismantle. She cited Arlington Heights, Washington v. Davis, Banovich, and she did not flinch. Your Honors, polling closures became 3 times more likely in majority black precincts compared to majority white precincts, with similar population density after the law was enacted. This is not anecdotal. This is in the record. The shift was complete. She was no longer a politician defending her people. She was now a constitutionalist defending the people's contract. And it was then for the first time that Justice Jackson leaned forward not to interrupt, but to engage. Counsel, Jackson said, voice measured. That's a compelling argument regarding Section 11C. Can you identify where, specifically, the discriminatory application appears in the district court findings? Crockett didn't fumble. Yes, Your Honor. Joint Appendix, pages 287 to 303. County-by-county data shows closures spiked in black majority areas. The district court acknowledged this, but erroneously applied rational basis review instead of the heightened scrutiny. Arlington Heights demands. There it was. She had met the moment, not by shouting over it, but by rising into it. Justice Jackson gave no outward sign of approval, but she did not speak again. Not for several minutes. Crockett continued her constitutional assault, not like a storm, but like a surgeon. We're not asking this court to invalidate the entire Georgia law under Ayot v. Planned Parenthood. You've held that surgical remedies are preferred when statutes are partially unconstitutional. We request that only Section 11C be struck, allowing Georgia to revise it before the next election. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was judicial precision. And for the first time, the justices were listening fully. The Crockett who had walked in to perform was now gone. The Crockett who stood before them now blouse crisp, voice steady, had earned her place. No one interrupted again. For a moment, no one spoke. Not the justices. Not the clerks. Not even the restless gallery. They were watching something rare. A black woman who had been corrected by power and responded with greater power, not vengeance, not defensiveness, but law, sharpened by humility. And now, Jasmine Crockett did the one thing no one had expected. She asked for less, but she asked for it exactly right. Your Honors, she said, her tone even. We are not seeking to dismantle Georgia's entire election code. Several heads tilted. Even Justice Alito looked up. We're asking this court to strike only Section 11C, the provision that grants unchecked authority to local officials to close polling places without public notice, standards, or oversight. The rest of the statute may stand, but this piece invites discrimination by design. It was a surgical ask, clean, focused, legally sound, and deeply political, because it gave the court an escape hatch, a way to uphold federalism while still protecting rights. Chief Justice Roberts, long known for preferring narrow rulings over sweeping judgments, leaned forward, hands folded. That's a considerably more tailored approach than what was presented in your briefs. Counsel, Crockett nodded once, not flattered, just prepared. Yes, Mr. Chief Justice. Our understanding of the constitutional violations evolved through this litigation. This focused remedy upholds voting rights while respecting the state's general authority over elections. And then came the remarkable moment. One the press would replay endlessly. Justice Barrett, often silent on issues of race, but meticulous about the Constitution's text, broke in. You're invoking ayat voi, Planned Parenthood. Correct. Limiting the remedy to only what's necessary. Exactly. Your Honor, Crockett responded. That decision reaffirmed the principle that courts should sever unconstitutional provisions when possible rather than invalidate entire laws. And do you believe Georgia's legislature can draft a revised version of Section 11C that complies with constitutional standards? I do, she said, with calm conviction. And they must, because the Constitution demands it. There was no posturing now, no raised voice, just a quiet confidence that comes from surviving fire and emerging sharper. Justice Jackson spoke again, her tone no longer slicing, but searching. Counsel, what specific procedural safeguards would you recommend be added to this section? At minimum, Crockett answered, a requirement for public notice, a mandatory public comment period, and a written justification subject to judicial review. That's not radical. That's republicanism. Not Republican the party. Republicanism. The idea that government derives its authority from consent and transparency. You could almost hear the resonance in the gallery. The old-school law professors, the retired civil rights attorneys, the generation that had bled for access and was now watching someone fight smart. Crockett had come full circle. She was no longer arguing from emotion. She was designing constitutional architecture right there, in front of the 9 most powerful legal minds in America, and they were listening. Even Justice Clarence Thomas, long skeptical of race-based legal arguments, tilted his head, not in disagreement, but in attention. The woman in white had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had turned a Supreme Court hearing into a masterclass in judicial advocacy. Her ask was not to undo Georgia. Her ask was to remind Georgia of the Constitution, and in doing so, she reminded the court and the country of something even greater. That dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand everything. It chooses what truly matters, and fights like hell for just that. When the gavel struck that final time, the courtroom emptied, but the moment didn't. It stayed. It lingered like a truth too powerful to leave. The next morning, it was all over the news. But for once, it wasn't the sound bites that led the story. It was the silence. The silence after Crockett's final answer. The silence when Justice Jackson didn't interrupt. The silence when the court, liberal and conservative, listened. 2 months later, the decision dropped. Crockett via Georgia Election Commission. Decided 6-3 majority. Section 11C of Georgia's voting law was struck down. The rest of the law upheld. The exact outcome Crockett had pivoted to. Under pressure. Under fire. Under 7 interruptions. The exact ask she made. Not in rage, but in reason. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice John Roberts, was clear. Unfettered discretion in election administration. Absent public safeguards. Invites discriminatory outcomes. This court must remain vigilant. Where structural imbalance endangers fundamental rights. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. The opinion referenced oral arguments 3 times. Every mention pointed toward the day Crockett turned the room. But it was Justice Jackson's concurring opinion that cemented the legacy. When statutory discretion disproportionately affects historically marginalized voters, this court is not only authorized, but obligated to apply heightened scrutiny. She wrote, that is not identity jurisprudence. That is constitutional fidelity. She was no longer sparring with Crockett. She was building beside her. Justice Kagan and Sotomayor joined the concurrence. Justice Barrett issued her own, citing the same principle. Procedural fairness is not partisan. It is structural. It is the difference between governance and control. Legal scholars across the country scrambled to rewrite their syllabi. Harvard Law added a new case study. The Jackson-Crockett Framework. Yale professors held a panel. When Advocacy Learns to Listen. At Howard University, a group of pre-law seniors gathered around a TV. Fists in the air, not because she won, but because she grew. She listened. And then she hit him with the Constitution. One student said, that's how you do it. In community centers from Selma to South Central, old black voters nodded in approval. She ain't just talking now. One elder said, she's lawing. Even the NAACP issued a statement calling the outcome a textbook example of strategic constitutional victory under racial scrutiny. The Washington Post editorial board dubbed it the Crockett Doctrine, a legal strategy that demands narrow relief, clear constitutional grounding, and disciplined courtroom conduct. But all the headlines missed something deeper. This wasn't just a legal win. It was a spiritual reckoning for two black women, one on the bench, one at the podium, who refused to let race be used and insisted it be understood. After the ruling, Crockett didn't run to MSNBC. She walked onto the Supreme Court steps and faced the cameras, voice steady, tone sober. Justice Jackson did what the court is supposed to do. She didn't treat me like a sister. She treated me like a lawyer, and she forced me to act like one. I wasn't ready when I stepped into that room, but I left it different, better, wiser. A reporter asked, "Was it humiliating?" She smiled, not with charm, but with clarity. "No. Being interrupted 7 times. That wasn't humiliation. That was correction. And I needed it. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is learn in public." Inside Jackson's chambers, as expected, there was silence. She declined all comment, but former clerks noted the opinion bore her fingerprints: tight logic, bold clarity, zero indulgence. She has always believed that the Constitution is too sacred for theatrics. One clerk said, she saw in Crockett not failure, but potential. And Crockett proved her right. Across Capitol Hill, lawmakers took notice. Quietly, 2 Republican-led states amended their own discretionary voting provisions without litigation. They had read the writing on the marble wall, because Crockett had done what few on Capitol Hill ever do. She entered a chamber of power. She stumbled, she listened, and then she stood back up, not louder, but sharper. The firebrand became a legal force, and the court, not known for compassion, rewarded her with respect. In the grand halls of American power, legacy is often loud. It's carved in marble, cast in bronze, blared across headlines. But sometimes, legacy whispers, and when it whispers, it asks, did you listen when it mattered? Jasmine Crockett came into that courtroom wearing fire. She left it carrying something greater. Discipline born from humility. She was interrupted 7 times. And in each interruption, a mirror was held to her face, not to shame her, but to shape her. She didn't crumble. She didn't lash out. She listened. And when she spoke again, she spoke not as a name, not as a race, not as a moment. She spoke as a voice of constitutional clarity. Justice Jackson didn't save her. She challenged her, and in doing so, lifted her. That's not just a courtroom story. That's our story. Our grandmothers stood in lines for hours to vote unprotected, unseen, unrecorded. Our uncles were purged from rolls with no warning. Our voices were paper ballots in the wind. But today, because a black woman listened, then stood back up, the Constitution heard us. This wasn't just about Section 11C. This was about Section 1 of our truth. That black excellence doesn't just perform, it endures, adapts, and elevates. And now, every law student will read about that day. Not because of who Crockett was when she entered, but because of who she became when the pressure rose. Let that be our lesson. Not every battle needs noise. Some need knowledge. Some need us to take off the jacket, set down the microphone, and step into our higher self. Let that be our legacy.